The year was 1872, and the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri were as wild and quiet as they were unforgiving. Dense woods rolled endlessly over the land, broken only by patches of farmland where smoke curled from chimneys and horses' hooves sank into the soft earth. Life in Ozark County moved slowly. The mornings were filled with the sound of roosters, and the nights carried the echo of coyotes. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's name, and secrets never stayed buried for long, though sometimes they were buried deep enough to be mistaken for silence. In the small town of Rockwell Hollow, the Cray estate stood apart from everything else. A white-columned house perched on a hill overlooking the valley, surrounded by acres of pasture and oak trees older than the town itself. To the locals, it was a symbol of pride and envy, a mark of wealth in a place where most families worked the fields from dawn to dusk. But those who lived closest to the Cray property often said that something about it didn't feel right. Maybe it was the strange quiet that lingered around the place, or the way the windows seemed to stare out across the valley like watching eyes. Lillian Cray, the only daughter of the family, had been raised inside those walls. People said she was a beauty, soft-spoken, pale and delicate as the lace dresses she wore. But there was something about her that made folks uneasy. Some said she was lonely. Others said she was spoiled by her father's money and her mother's indulgence. And then some whispered that Lillian wasn't quite right in the head. No one said it out loud, of course, not in a town where manners mattered more than truth. The Crays were respected, even feared in quiet ways. Mr. Silas Cray, Lillian's father, had inherited his fortune from timber and land deals that no one could quite explain. He was a tall man with a sharp voice and colder eyes, known for lending money to neighbors and then taking their land when they couldn't pay. His wife, Eleanor, was the kind of woman who smiled at everyone but trusted no one. Together, they were what the town called proper people. The kind others bowed to at church and spoke kindly about when they weren't listening. But wealth doesn't build walls strong enough to keep out madness or misery. Inside the Cray home, the air was heavy with something that words couldn't name. Servants came and went, some without notice, some whispering stories about sleepless nights and Lillian's strange fits, times when she'd cry for hours, or laugh when no one else could find the joke. Still, to anyone outside the estate, the Crays appeared perfect. That year, the county was changing. The railroad was moving closer, and talk of new businesses stirred among the men in town. But Rockwell Hollow was still a place ruled by reputation, by what people chose to believe. The Crays had power, and power was everything. Then one summer evening, something shifted. It began with small things, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't live under that roof. Lillian started wandering the property at night, barefoot, her white nightgown brushing the tall grass. A farmhand once found her standing near the barn, staring at the sky as if waiting for something to fall from it. She didn't speak a word, just turned and walked back toward the house. When he told Mr. Cray, the man only said, "My daughter is prone to fancies. You do well to forget it." But the farmhand didn't forget. In town, rumors began to stir. People said Lillian had taken an interest in someone far beneath her family's station. No one could say who, but every whisper carried the same tone, pity and disapproval. A Cray woman, they said, shouldn't be seen speaking with a hired help. It wasn't proper. By the time autumn came, the Cray estate seemed colder than usual. The leaves around the house turned faster, the shadows stretched longer, and a kind of stillness settled over the property like a spell. Servants said Lillian was spending more time in her room, writing in her journals and refusing to eat. Her mother claimed it was just a melancholy spell, as she called it. But Silas Cray wasn't a man who tolerated weakness, not from his daughter, not from anyone. Then came the man. He wasn't from Rockwell Hollow. Some said he came from Springfield, others said he'd worked on the railroad crews further south. His name, at least the one he gave, was Thomas. He was quiet, polite, and had eyes that didn't flinch when they met yours. He came to work on the Cray property as a laborer, fixing fences and tending to the livestock. He kept to himself, didn't drink, and always tipped his hat to the ladies in town. But someone saw him speaking to Lillian by the creek that ran behind the Cray property. They said she laughed, a sound that hadn't been heard in months, and he looked at her like she was made of something fragile and bright. From that moment, everything changed. No one knew how long their secret meetings went on or how deep Lillian's feelings grew. But those who watched her said she began to glow again, as if something inside her had woken up. She smiled more. She asked to go riding again. She even spoke kindly to the servants. Yet underneath it all, there was a strange edge to her happiness, a kind of feverish light in her eyes that made even her mother uneasy. And then one evening, the laughter stopped. The house on the hill went silent. For 3 days, the servants whispered behind closed doors. No one saw Lillian. No one saw Thomas either. When someone finally went to the barn, they found something there that would haunt Rockwell Hollow for generations. The Cray name, once untouchable, would soon become a curse whispered only in the dark. And the story of what Lillian did, or what was done to her, would mark that quiet town forever. The weeks that followed the first whispers about Lillian and Thomas carried an uneasy quiet, like the air before a storm. Rockwell Hollow was a small place, and word traveled fast. By the time autumn deepened, most of the town had heard something, some version of what they believed to be true. The Cray family never spoke of it, of course. They held their heads high at church, Lillian sitting beside her mother with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her face pale and expressionless. But beneath that calm surface, everything inside the Cray estate was beginning to crack. Lillian's mother, Eleanor, had noticed the changes first. The late-night walks. The laughter didn't sound like her daughter's old laugh. The soft humming came from Lillian's room long after everyone had gone to bed. Eleanor had been raised to believe that every feeling should be hidden, every want contained. But she had never known how to control her daughter. Lillian was quiet, but her emotions ran wild beneath the surface, like fire beneath ice. One night, Eleanor followed her. The moon was low, the grass damp with dew, and she watched from the shadow of the veranda as Lillian crept across the field toward the creek. She was barefoot again, her white nightgown dragging in the mud. There by the water, a figure waited. Eleanor could only make out his shape, tall and still, but when Lillian reached him, he took her hand. They spoke softly, their voices too far away to hear, and then she leaned forward, resting her head against his chest. Eleanor turned back toward the house, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. She didn't speak a word of it to Silas that night, but something in her had changed. The next morning, she couldn't look at her daughter the same way. Every movement, every quiet smile seemed like betrayal, and yet when she thought of telling her husband, she stopped herself. Silas Cray was not a man who forgave. But Silas wasn't blind. He'd begun to notice the strange energy in his home, the way the servants went silent when he entered a room, the way Lillian seemed distant, distracted. One afternoon, while inspecting the stables, he found a carved trinket hidden in the hayloft, a small wooden bird, clumsy but carved with care. On its underside were the initials, T.H. Silas turned it over in his palm, and his jaw tightened. He didn't have to ask who it belonged to. That evening, he called for Thomas. Thomas stood before him in the study, hat in hand, his shirt damp with sweat from the day's work. The lamplight flickered across Silas's face, catching the sharp line of his mouth. "You've been spending time where you shouldn't," Silas said quietly. Thomas didn't speak. "You were hired to mend fences, not break the ones that keep my family respectable." Thomas's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. "With respect, sir, I haven't done anything improper." Silas smiled faintly. "Improper is not a word decided by you." He dismissed Thomas with a wave of his hand, but watched him go, his face cold as stone. That night, Thomas packed his things, ready to leave the property before dawn, but Lillian found him first. She caught him by the stables, her hair unbound, her eyes wet with tears. "He told you to leave, didn't he?" Thomas tried to calm her, saying it was better this way, that it was safer for both of them. But Lillian shook her head. "You don't understand. He'll make it seem like you did something wrong. He'll ruin you." He took her hands, trying to steady her. "Lillian, I don't care what he says. You'll be fine. You'll always be fine." She looked at him then, her voice trembling. "No, I won't. I can't go back to that house." When he promised he'd return once things settled, she believed him. He left before sunrise, his figure fading into the fog that rolled through the hills. The next few days were quiet. Lillian pretended to be unbothered, eating breakfast with her parents, writing in her journals, and attending Sunday service. But her eyes had lost their warmth again, and her laughter had disappeared. Silas believed the matter was over, but Eleanor knew better. She began to notice the small things first. Letters tucked between the pages of books in the library, bits of fabric gone from the sewing room, and Lillian's absence during the early hours of the morning. She said nothing, but her fear grew sharper with each passing day. Then one night, Lillian vanished. The servants woke to find her bed empty, the sheets cold. Silas sent men into the woods with lanterns, searching the hills and the creekside. They found her 2 hours later, sitting on a fallen log by the water, her dress soaked, her hair clinging to her face. When her father tried to speak, she only said, "You can't stop it, Papa. You can't stop what's already begun." After that, he locked her in her room for 3 days. No visitors, no letters, only silence. but even walls couldn't contain what was growing inside her. Lillian began to change. Her eyes grew hollow, her voice quieter. She no longer cried when her father shouted. She just stared through him as if she were already gone somewhere else. Her mother would sit by the door at night, listening to her whispering to herself. Sometimes it sounded like prayer, sometimes like conversation. And then came the drawings, strange sketches that the maid found beneath her pillow. A bird trapped inside a cage, a man standing in a field, a figure hanging from a tree. Meanwhile, in town, people began to talk again. Someone claimed to have seen Thomas Cray near the edge of the property at night. Others said he'd been asking questions in town about Lillian, trying to send her word. Silas heard these rumors too, and one afternoon he rode into town to find him. They met behind the general store, where Thomas was unloading a wagon. "You stay away from my land," Silas said, his voice low but sharp. Thomas stood straight, gripping the handle of the crate. "I mean no harm to your family, sir." "You mean harm just by breathing near it," Silas snapped. "You think she understands what she's doing? She's a child playing at love. You'll destroy her." Thomas didn't move. Maybe she's the only one in that house who's ever truly alive. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Silas turned and left, but not before saying, "If you come near her again, I'll make sure you disappear from this county." By the time Silas returned home, the wind had picked up and the sky had turned gray. That evening, the Cray household sat at dinner in silence. Lillian barely touched her food. Her mother tried to speak to her, but Lillian's eyes were on the window, on the darkening fields beyond. 2 nights later, thunder rolled through the Ozarks. The servants said they heard footsteps in the hall past midnight, soft and hurried. When the morning came, Lillian's bed was empty again. This time, she didn't come back. The search went on for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, a farmhand found her sitting by the creek again, clutching something in her hands. It was a small wooden bird. When her father approached, she looked up at him with a calm so strange it chilled him. "Thomas came to me," she whispered. "He said he'd take me away, but you wouldn't let him." Her father's voice broke for the first time in years. "Lillian, he's gone. He left this place." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Then someone else took him." Within a week, the sheriff from the next town was called in. Thomas hadn't been seen in days. His horse was still at the stable near the edge of town, his belongings untouched. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he'd run away. Others said Silas had seen to it that he never left the valley alive. Inside the Cray house, something dark had settled. Alina tried to pray, but her hands trembled too much to hold the rosary. Silas drank more than he ever had, packing the study late into the night. And Lillian, she moved through the house like a ghost, her steps soundless, her gaze distant. One night, Alina entered her room and found her standing before the mirror, brushing her hair. "Mother," she said softly, "when 2 people love each other and one of them disappears, does the other disappear too?" Alina felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, darling?" Lillian smiled faintly. "Maybe love isn't real unless someone pays for it." The words lingered in Alina's mind long after she left the room. That was the last night she saw her daughter speak with such calmness. As winter neared, the Cray home grew darker. The lamps burned lower, the servants whispered less. Everyone felt the weight of something waiting to happen. Silas's temper grew worse. He accused the servants of lying, of hiding letters, of conspiring with Thomas's friends. No one dared argue with him. But Lillian's silence frightened them most. Some nights, she'd slip out of her room and stand at the top of the stairs, staring down into the dark, her lips moving as if she were speaking to someone unseen. The maids started crossing themselves when they passed her. One night a storm came, rain so heavy it turned the roads to rivers. Lightning flashed across the hills, lighting the Cray house in white bursts. Alina woke to the sound of a door slamming somewhere below. When she went to check, she saw the front door swinging open, and in the distance, through the sheets of rain, she saw her daughter walking down the hill toward the creek. By the time they found her again, the storm had passed. Lillian stood barefoot in the mud, her dress torn, her hands covered in dirt. When her father shouted her name, she turned slowly, her eyes empty. "He's not gone," she said quietly. "He's waiting." Something in her voice made even Silas step back. In the days that followed, Lillian stopped speaking altogether. She spent her hours by the window, staring toward the woods, her hair uncombed, her face pale as wax. Her mother tried everything, doctors, prayers, even the old healer woman from town, but nothing changed. It was as if she'd slipped into a world that no one else could reach. And somewhere deep inside her, something had begun to unravel. The Cray estate, once proud and perfect, was now a house of whispers and shadows. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the windows made a leaner flinch. Even Silas, for all his pride, began to feel something close to fear. Because every night, without fail, Lillian would whisper one name before she fell asleep. Thomas. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind carried through the valley, someone whispered it back. It was the night the valley went silent. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled of thunder and wet soil. Fog rolled through the trees, thick and low, curling around the Cray estate like smoke. Inside, every lamp had been dimmed. The servants had gone to bed early, uneasy after another long evening of raised voices and slamming doors. Only 3 people remained awake in that vast house: Silas, Elena, and Lillian. For weeks the house had been on edge. Lillian's silence had become unbearable, her stillness more haunting than her outbursts once were. Silas had grown convinced she was losing her mind, and Elena, exhausted by fear and guilt, began to avoid her own daughter's eyes. Yet something in the air that night felt different, heavier, as if the house itself was waiting. It was near midnight when Silas entered her room again. He had a letter in his hand, a crumpled piece of paper that had been slipped under his door earlier that evening. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. He's near the creek again. She's been meeting him there every night. When he read it, his vision blurred with rage. He had warned Thomas. He had sworn the boy would never set foot on his land again. If this was true, if his daughter had defied him once more, then everything he'd built, everything he'd protected, would collapse. He stormed into her room without knocking. Lillian was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair in slow, steady strokes. Her reflection met his eyes in the mirror, calm and distant. "Where is he?" Silas demanded. She didn't answer. "Don't you lie to me, girl," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "I know he's been here. I know you've been sneaking out." Still, she said nothing. She set the brush down gently and turned toward him, her face pale, her lips trembling only slightly. "Father," she whispered, "you can't keep him away forever." Something snapped in him then. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. "That man is gone. He's dead to this family. You shame your name every time you speak of him." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice grew stronger. "Then I'll be dead too." Elena heard the first shout from down the hall. She rushed toward the room, her nightgown dragging on the stairs, her heart pounding. By the time she reached the door, Silas's voice had risen into a roar. She pushed the door open to see him standing over Lillian, his hand gripping her arm. The brush lay broken on the floor. "Silas, stop," Elena cried. "You're hurting her." He turned toward her, his eyes wild. "She's been lying to us. She's made a fool of this family." "She's our daughter," Elena shouted back. For a moment all 3 stood frozen in the golden glow of the lamplight. Then Lillian spoke again, quiet, almost too soft to hear. "You already hurt him. Isn't that enough?" The words hit Silas like a blade. His hand fell away. "What did you say?" She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a calm that terrified him. "You killed him." Elena gasped, "Lillian." But Lillian went on, her voice distant, almost dreamlike. "You couldn't stand that I loved him. You couldn't stand that someone else saw me." Silas stepped back, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do," she said softly. "You took him from me." Elena could see it happening, the way his face changed, the way something dark passed through his eyes. It wasn't anger anymore. It was fear, fear of losing control, of losing everything that defined him. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't understand what kind of man he was." "He was better than you," she said. And that was when the shouting started again, words lost to noise, rage echoing off the walls. Elena tried to step between them, but Silas pushed her aside. Lillian screamed, the sound sharp and desperate. Then came the crash of glass as the oil lamp toppled from the table. Fire leapt across the rug in a flash of gold. "Silas," Elena screamed, grabbing for the lamp, but the flames were already spreading. In the chaos, Lillian ran. She darted past her father, down the hall, barefoot and trembling. Silas stumbled after her, shouting her name, his voice echoing down the stairs. The house was filled with smoke and light. Servants began to stir, doors opening, feet pounding on the floors above. Lillian reached the front door, flung it open, and ran into the night. The rain had started again, soft and cold, soaking through her nightgown as she fled across the field. Behind her, she could still hear her father's voice, calling her back, cursing her, pleading with her. It was all the same sound now. She didn't stop until she reached the creek. The water shimmered under the thin moonlight, swollen from the weak storms. Her breath came in gasps, her heart pounding in her throat. She called out his name once, Thomas, but the woods only answered with the rush of the current. Then in the distance, she saw something move. A figure stood by the tree line, her heart leapt. She took a step forward, the mud cold beneath her feet. "Thomas," she whispered. The figure didn't move. She took another step, her tears mixing with the rain. "Please, don't leave me again." But when the lightning flashed, she saw it wasn't him. It was her father. His coat was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes hollow. He looked older, smaller than she'd ever seen him. "Lillian," he said quietly, "come home." She shook her head, backing away toward the edge of the creek. "You killed him." "I didn't," he said, his voice breaking. "He left, that's all, he left you." She stared at him for a long moment, her breath trembling. "You're lying." He stepped closer. "Please, we can fix this, we can start again." But she wasn't listening anymore. She was staring down into the water, into the black reflection that rippled below, and in it she swore she saw Thomas's face, pale, still. Something inside her broke. When Silas reached for her, she pulled away, slipping on the muddy bank. He lunged to grab her arm, but she fought him, screaming, "You don't get to touch me!" The struggle was desperate, two figures silhouetted in the stormlight, both crying, both lost. He tried to hold her still to stop her from falling, but she twisted from his grasp. His foot slipped. Her hand struck out blindly, catching his shoulder, and then he was gone. There was a splash, a sharp cry, and the sound of rushing water swallowing everything. For a second, Lillian stood frozen, staring into the dark. Then she screamed. She dropped to her knees by the water's edge, reaching out into the current, her hands scraping against the rocks. The rain poured harder now, washing the blood from a cut on her wrist. "Father!" she cried. "Papa, please!" But there was no answer, only the endless sound of the creek rushing on. By the time the servants found her, she was standing waist-deep in the water, shaking, whispering over and over. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." They pulled her out, her skin ice-cold, her eyes wide and vacant. Back at the house, Elinor collapsed when she heard the news. The sheriff was called before dawn, and by sunrise they found Silas's body a mile downstream, tangled in reeds, his face turned toward the sky. Lillian sat in the parlor, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the fire that now burned low in the hearth. Her mother knelt beside her, holding her hand, but Lillian didn't move. Her lips parted only once, her voice barely audible. "He was already dead," she whispered. "He's been dead since that night." No one knew what she meant. Later, when the sheriff questioned her, she said very little. She told him her father had slipped, that she'd tried to save him. But when he asked why she was at the creek, she only said, "I was meeting someone." The sheriff's expression softened, but the other men exchanged uneasy glances. They searched the woods for signs of another person, but found nothing, no tracks, no footprints but her own. That night the Cray house burned again, not from flames, but from whispers. Servants packed their things and left before morning. Elinor sat by her husband's coffin, her face hollow, her eyes empty. And upstairs, Lillian locked herself in her room, sitting by the window, humming softly to herself. Outside, the wind carried through the trees, brushing against the windows like fingertips. Some said they heard a man's voice whisper her name in the night. Others swore they saw a figure by the creek for days after, standing still beneath the trees, watching the house on the hill. But inside, only one sound remained, the soft, steady rhythm of Lillian's voice, whispering into the dark. "Thomas, Thomas, Thomas." The morning after Silas Cray's death dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself refused to look upon the valley. Mist hung over the fields, swallowing the fences and trees, and the sound of the creek drifted faintly through the air, calm again, indifferent. Word spread fast through Rockwell Hollow. Before noon, the Cray estate was surrounded by wagons, horses, and curious faces. The same neighbors who once bowed to the Crays at church now stood at their gates, whispering. The official story was simple. The sheriff told the papers that Silas Cray had slipped during the storm while trying to bring his daughter home. A tragic accident, no foul play. But in a town as small as Rockwell Hollow, truth was never decided by law, it was shaped by whispers, and everyone had their own version. Some said Lillian had gone mad after losing her lover and had pushed her father into the water. Others said Silas had been drunk and cruel, that the Lord had punished him for his pride. A few still believed in the old story, that Thomas had come back, and that whatever happened by the creek that night wasn't meant for Silas at all. Inside the Cray house, the silence was unbearable. The servants moved quietly, careful not to speak her name in front of Alina. Lillian stayed locked in her room for days, refusing food, refusing to speak. Her mother visited her every morning, knocking softly before opening the door. Lillian would be sitting in the same chair by the window, staring out toward the trees where the creek ran. She didn't cry anymore. She didn't pray. She just watched the horizon as if waiting for something to return. Alina had aged 10 years in a week. Her once perfect hair hung loose, her dresses wrinkled. She tried to hold the family together, but there was no family left to hold. The townspeople avoided her at the market. The women who once envied her pearls now crossed the street when they saw her coming. They whispered that the Cray name had been cursed from the start. At Silas's funeral, few people came. The preacher spoke in a quiet voice, choosing words that could mean many things but said nothing at all. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." Alina sat in the front pew, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the coffin. Lillian didn't speak a word. She just sat still, her face white as the lilies laid upon the casket. When the service ended and the last of the townspeople had gone, Alina took her daughter's hand. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. "It was an accident." Lillian turned to her slowly, her voice distant. "If it was an accident, why does he still call my name?" Alina froze. "Who?" But Lillian only looked back at the creek visible through the trees and said nothing more. The sheriff came by again a few days later. He said he needed to close up the matter. His words were kind, but his eyes carried the same question everyone was asking silently. What really happened that night? He asked to speak to Lillian again, but Alina refused. "She's ill," she said. "She needs rest." The sheriff didn't press. He tipped his hat and left, though he lingered at the gate for a long while, watching the girl's shadow move behind her window. By late winter, the Cray estate began to fall apart. The workers stopped showing up. The barns sagged under the snow. The house that once stood like a symbol of power now looked hollow, stripped of life. The Cray wealth, once whispered about with envy, became something people spoke of with pity. Alina spent her days sitting in the parlor, reading the same pages over and over, her mind wandering. She tried to pray again, but found that the words felt empty in her mouth. Every sound in the house made her flinch, the creak of the floorboards, the soft knock of the wind against the windows, and always from upstairs she could hear Lillian humming. Sometimes in the dead of night, Alina would wake to footsteps in the hall. She'd go to her daughter's room and find the bed empty, the curtains blowing gently in the cold air. Once, she followed the faint light of a lantern down the hill all the way to the creek. There she saw Lillian standing barefoot in the mud, holding the small wooden bird that once belonged to Thomas. Alina didn't speak. She just watched as her daughter whispered into the dark water, her voice trembling, her eyes full of something both lost and certain. "He said he'd come back," Lillian murmured, "and he has." When Alina touched her shoulder, Lillian turned and smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Mother. It's only fair that he gets what he's owed." After that night, Alina began locking the doors again. She sent for doctors from Springfield, men who spoke of hysteria and delusions. They gave Lillian tonics that dulled her into silence, but nothing changed the faraway look in her eyes. As months passed, Rockwell Hollow moved on. The Cray scandal faded into something people mentioned only when the evenings were long and the whiskey was strong. New families bought land and new gossip took root. But the Cray house remained untouched, its white paint peeling, its shutters hanging loose. Children began to whisper stories about it. How the ghost of Lillian Cray wandered the halls calling for her lost lover, how her father's voice could still be heard by the creek on stormy nights. Even grown men avoided the path near the water after dark. But Lillian wasn't dead, not yet. By the following spring, Alina was a shadow of herself. Her hair had gone gray, and her once sharp eyes had dulled with exhaustion. She rarely left the house, choosing instead to stay near her daughter. She read aloud to her in the evenings, even when Lillian didn't respond. She brushed her hair, dressed her, and tried to remind her of the world beyond the windows. One afternoon, Alina found her daughter sitting by the window as always, the wooden bird in her lap. "Do you remember the song your father used to whistle?" Alina asked softly. Lillian nodded faintly. "He whistles it still. I hear him when the rain comes." Alina tried to smile, but her hands trembled. "It's only the wind, darling." Lillian turned her head slowly, her eyes empty and unblinking. "No, mother, the wind doesn't call my name." That night, Elinor didn't sleep. She sat in the parlor, the fire burning low, listening to the quiet hum from upstairs. For the first time, she began to wonder if her daughter's madness wasn't madness at all, but punishment. When the first thunder rolled across the hills that spring, Elinor's heart sank. The rain came again, soft and steady. She climbed the stairs, opened her daughter's door, and found the room empty. The window was open, the curtains blowing inward. She ran outside, calling her name into the storm. Her feet sank into the wet grass, her nightdress clinging to her legs. She reached the creek, breathless, her lantern flickering in the wind. There by the water's edge stood Lillian. She wasn't crying, she wasn't afraid, she was smiling. "He's come for me," she said quietly. "Lillian, no," Elinor whispered, stepping closer. "Please come home." Lillian shook her head. "I am home." And before her mother could reach her, she stepped into the water. Elinor screamed and ran forward, but the current was stronger than it looked. The lantern slipped from her hand and fell into the creek, the light vanishing into the dark. She stumbled to her knees, reaching into the rushing water, but there was nothing there. Only the endless, cold current that had taken her husband and now her daughter. When morning came, the servants found Elinor sitting by the water, her dress torn, her hair undone. Her voice was gone. She just stared at the creek, whispering something no one could understand. They never found Lillian's body. The official story remained the same, a tragedy born of grief and madness. But the people of Rockwell Hollow would never forget. They said that on certain nights, when the fog hangs low and the wind moves through the trees just right, you can still hear her voice drifting from the water, a soft, broken whisper calling for the man she loved and the father she lost. And in that quiet valley, where pride and sorrow once lived side by side, the Cray name became nothing more than a ghost. Years passed, but the name Cray still clung to Rockwell Hollow like a shadow that refused to lift. The white manor on the hill, once a symbol of pride and authority, stood empty now, its windows dark, its paint peeling, the gardens overrun with weeds. Time had erased the laughter, the wealth, the dinner parties. What remained was only silence and rumor, a story that lived longer than the people who had inspired it. For those who had known them, the Crays became less of a family and more of a warning. The townsfolk said their downfall had been born from their own hands, from secrets too long buried, from love that defied reason, and from pride that turned inward until it devoured itself. There were no trials, no formal accusations. The sheriff had long since retired, and the case, if it could be called that, remained closed. Silas Cray's death was written off as a tragic accident, and Lillian's disappearance became a mystery too painful for anyone to dig up. But among the older townspeople, there was always a sense that justice had already been served, not by the law, but by something older, colder, and less forgiving. The Crays had ruled the valley for decades with control and reputation, but in the end, neither title nor wealth could shield them from consequence. Elinor Cray lived for a few more years after her daughter's disappearance. Her health declined quickly, but her mind faded even faster. Some said she would wander the halls at night, calling for her husband, sometimes for her daughter, and sometimes for the boy with the broken voice. She was found one spring morning, seated by the same parlor window where she used to wait for her family to come home. The doctor said it was her heart that failed her, but the servants swore she had been smiling when she died. The manor passed through the hands of distant relatives who never visited. The land was eventually sold to strangers who did not know about the valley's ghosts, yet the locals never forgot. Children still dared each other to walk past the house after dark, claiming they heard a woman's voice whispering near the creek, singing the tune Thomas used to play on his fiddle. When the Cray family fell, the town changed. The same people who once bowed to their wealth began to question the social order that had kept them silent. The church that Silas had funded lost attendance. People whispered that his sermons had been more about control than faith. The story of the Crays became a quiet revolt against the old ways. Wives began speaking a little louder at the dinner table. Servants began asking for fairer wages. Daughters, who once were raised to marry money rather than seek meaning, started reading books from outside the hollow. No one ever said it aloud, but everyone understood. The Crays' tragedy had peeled back something ugly about the world they'd built. A world of appearances, obedience, and unspoken violence. Silas had believed that love could be commanded, that fear could preserve order. Elinor had believed that silence could protect her family. And Lillian, poor, delicate Lillian, had believed that love could redeem what cruelty had destroyed. They were all wrong, and they paid for it. The ghosts that remained. Even decades later, travelers passing through Rockwell Hollow would hear the stories. The locals told them with the same reverence reserved for sacred things. They said the Cray house was cursed because it had been built on lies. They said the water of the creek never ran clear again after that night. But those who looked deeper saw something less supernatural and more profoundly human. The curse wasn't some otherworldly punishment. It was the lingering weight of guilt, control, and grief passed from one generation to the next. The Crays were not monsters. They were people, bound by the expectations of their time, undone by the choices they refused to face. The tragedy reminded the townsfolk of something uncomfortable. That beneath every facade of civility, beneath every well-kept home and Sunday smile, there could exist chaos, a quiet, restrained kind of madness that only needed one crack to break free. The story of the Crays became a mirror for the town's own moral contradictions. In their downfall, people saw reflections of themselves. The jealousy that festers in silence, the weight of duty that crushes the soul, the way love can turn cruel when forced into cages. It raised questions that no sermon could answer. Was Silas a villain, or a man twisted by fear of losing control? Was Lillian a victim, or the architect of her own undoing? Was Elena complicit, or just another prisoner of her husband's will? In truth, the Cray tragedy blurred the lines between guilt and grief, between punishment and consequence. It showed that evil doesn't always arrive with fire and fury. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, dressed in respectability. And for those who listened, the story became a lesson. That morality is not inherited, and that love, when bound by power, becomes something unrecognizable. By the time the century turned, Rockwell Hollow had grown into something unrecognizable. The fields were fenced, the old church replaced, and the Cray name faded from conversation. But when storms rolled across the valley, when thunder echoed down the creek bed, there were still those who claimed to hear faint laughter, a girl's laughter, rising and falling with the wind. Some said it was a ghost. Others said it was simply memory, the kind that clings to a place too strongly to fade. But maybe, in some small way, it was something else entirely. Maybe it was the valley remembering. Remembering a family that had everything and lost it. Remembering a daughter who wanted only to love and be free. Remembering that justice, in the end, does not always wear a badge or carry a gavel. Sometimes it simply takes the form of silence, of a house that no one will live in again, of a story that no one can quite forget. And so the legend endured, not as a tale of ghosts, but as a quiet reminder of what happens when power outweighs compassion, when truth is buried too deep, and when love, once pure, is forced to live behind locked doors. In Rockwell Hollow, the Cray tragedy became both a warning and a prayer. That no family, no matter how mighty, can escape the weight of its own making. That no secret stays buried forever. And that in the stillness after the storm, when the water runs dark and the wind hums through the trees, you might just hear a voice, not crying, not cursing, but forgiving. A final mercy in a place that had long forgotten how.